Sante and Kenny Kimes. Their crime spree across America included fraud, robbery, and murder. Sante Kimes and her son Kenny were a modern incarnation of Ma Barker and her boys. Desperate for status and money, Sante turned illegal immigrants into slaves, lured men into her bedroom, and killed at least one elderly millionaire. In many crimes, her son Kenny served as her accomplice. Together, Sante and Kenny Kimes brought new meaning to the term family values.
Hello, my name is Kenneth Kimes. You don't really know me. You may think you know me, but you do not. You may think you know my mother, but you don't.
My son and I are innocent. There is a huge evil cover-up going on. The police have made a terrible mistake.
I think Sante and Kenny are one of the worst criminals to come down the pike in many a year. They are vicious, they are greedy, they are killers.
I've been denied defense, telephones, lottery.
Everything in her life was an object to be used. Everyone in her life was a person to be manipulated.
You genuinely liked her for some reason. She was totally charming. She could talk you into anything.
You did not want to be an enemy of the Kimeses, because that meant they could justify doing anything to you to protect themselves.
They've been called mother and son grifters, the queen and prince of con artists, Bonnie and son of Clyde. The shocking tale of Sante and Kenny Kimes captured headlines after their arrest in July 1998 for the murder of a wealthy New York socialite.
I used to believe in this country. I don't believe in this country anymore. Americans are endangered. Trust me, it can happen to you. It can happen to your mother. It could happen to your son. We have done nothing wrong.
Sante Kimes has called herself many names, including Sante and Sandy, but little has been known about her formative years until now. Biography located her estranged sister, who told us in an exclusive interview what it was like to grow up with Sante.
The strongest memory I have is seeing her eyes and her smiling when she's hurting me.
Sante Singers was born on a farm in Oklahoma City on July 24, 1934. She was the third of Prama and Mary Singer's 4 children. Her parents were an unlikely couple. The East Indian farmer and a Dutch housewife had met in the early 1920s at a state fair where Sante's father was performing in a magic show. He had traveled the world before coming to America in 1919 and held jobs ranging from herb doctor to vaudeville magician.
And he was quite an attractive, tall man, and intriguing, mysterious. There was an instant attraction. She married him, I think, in a couple of weeks.
Sante's mother, Mary Van Horn, was raised in a strict household run by her father, a Presbyterian minister. He did not approve of her marriage to an Indian. Shortly after their wedding, the couple moved to Oklahoma, where they bought a farm and quickly started a family. They had a son, Karam, followed by a daughter they named Premi. Sante was the baby of the family until her sister Retha was born in 1939. A year later, their father died of heart disease, leaving their mother, Mary, alone with 4 children to support.
My mother was very passive, very easily controlled, and basically very fearful of the world.
Mary cleaned houses and took in laundry for money. Her son and oldest daughter looked after Sante and Retha while she was at work. Sante idolized her older brother, Karam, who lavished her with attention. But the brother and sister did not have a typical sibling relationship.
I often would see them with her sitting on his lap, hugging him, laughing, and observed times when his hand was in places that were inappropriate.
Karam had an explosive temper and was often violent. After Sante's father died, her mother could not discipline him.
My brother hit my mother in the face, knocked her on the floor. There was a lot of blood, and he stole her wedding ring and any money that she had and left.
The brother Sante adored skipped town without saying goodbye. Soon, her older sister also ran away, leaving young Sante to take care of Retha while her mother worked. By now, Sante's behavior had grown increasingly aggressive and sadistic.
She would say, "It's time for the fire." She would have me strike a match, and she would hold the flame underneath each finger, and if I didn't do it right, then we had to start over.
Retha wasn't the only one who endured her abuse. Sante also spent hours torturing animals on the farm.
The goats were tied up, so she would take hat pins and she would stick them in their hindquarters. And the dogs, when she could get a hold of one, she would put clothespins on their nose, their ears, and on their genitals. My sister enjoyed hurting living things.
While Sante wreaked havoc at home, at school she was left alone. Her classmates didn't want to be friends with an Indian. By the mid-1940s, authorities had determined that Sante and her sister Retha were being neglected by their mother. The two children were immediately taken away and placed in a home for girls.
My mother was hysterical about us being in there, so she went and made a plan that she'd pick us up and we would go to California.
Once in Los Angeles, Mary, Sante, and Retha moved into an apartment above a factory in a seedy part of town. The factory owner felt sorry for them and let them live there for free, but a change of scenery did nothing to stop Sante's violent behavior.
My mother was so frightened of Sante because Sante would have maybe 2 or 3 rages a day. She was just, you could not contain the rage. And it was usually over something that she wanted, and if she was told she couldn't have it, then the rage would start. So of course she got everything that she wanted.
After about a year in Los Angeles, Sante befriended a couple who owned a soda shop and movie theater in Studio City. They thought she was a charming girl who needed a more stable home life. So they introduced her to the woman's sister, Mary Chambers, and her husband, Ed, who lived in Carson City, Nevada.
They asked if they could adopt her, and my mother was not resistive to this at all. And I remember the day that she left, my mother and I danced.
In 1947, 12-year-old Sante moved to Carson City to live with the Chambers. Ed worked for Nevada's Army National Guard, running its equipment and maintenance shops, and Mary was a bookkeeper. They also had a 7-year-old adopted son named Howard.
The Chambers family was a very affluent family. They were some of the upstanding regulars in town. Whenever there was an event, such as a dance or a party, they were invited to it.
They wanted to give both these children a good home. Ed had a little bit of a drinking problem, but clearly he tried to be a good father to her.
Sante eagerly embraced her new station in life and even changed her name to Sandy Chambers. She used white powder to cover her olive skin and dressed in the latest fashions.
She went from rags to riches, technically, okay, because now she had her own room, she was wearing pretty things, and she was making friends.
She was well endowed with these beautiful teeth and this just glorious smile. She always had her hair done up in the most modern of hairstyles, and she walked with a little bit of a flounce. She just had it all.
But a new home did not change Sante's old habits, including intimidating younger kids with fire.
She had the other kids do it. They took, after I was tied up, they took my shoe off and my sock on one foot, and they stuck a match in between my toes and lit it. But I was crying, and that she was more interested in that than the fact that she gave me a hot foot.
In the fall of 1947, Sandy entered the 8th grade and became friends with an easygoing classmate named Ruth Tom. Wherever Sandy ventured, Ruth would follow.
In the 8th grade, myself and another person had been elected cheerleaders, and we went out to a game in a nearby town, and all of a sudden she and Ruthie appeared in cheerleading outfits, and they would beat us to the floor if they possibly could. It was kind of like, what are you doing? You know, we're the cheerleaders, not you.
Already she's enjoying the adrenaline rush, the thrill of playing the system, playing people. She could control Ruth. Ruth was the subservient one. Ruth was the passive one.
In 1948, 14-year-old Sandy entered Carson High School. By now, her stunts were becoming more daring and were getting her into trouble. In 1950, at the age of 16, she was arrested for shoplifting a lipstick from a Carson City department store. Even though she had the money to pay for it, the case was dismissed.
It's not about need, it's about risk. It's about riding the edge. She has a desire to steal things for the sake of just getting away with it.
Sandy graduated from high school in 1952 and moved back to California with her friend Ruth. There, she caught the eye of a mild-mannered college senior named Lee Powers. The two dated for a year before Powers graduated and enlisted in the Army. Sandy wanted to get married, so she lied that she was pregnant. Lee and Sandy were married on May 9th, 1956.
It's hard to say what Sandy was hoping to get from this man. Maybe she felt it gave her security, that she was married to a guy and he was going to support her.
After a few months, it became clear that his new bride wasn't pregnant, but Lee never confronted her. Sandy quickly lost interest in her new role as a housewife. She hated that her husband didn't make much money. After just 1 year of marriage, she left him. She wasted no time in contacting an old high school boyfriend named Ed Walker. On November 9th, 1957, just 6 months after her first marriage ended, 23-year-old Sandy Chambers married for the second time.
I think that Mom knew that she could probably wear the pants in that family, kind of control him. He was a smart man, hard worker, knew that she could probably count on getting the riches out of someone like that.
Her new husband was a general contractor who built homes in Sacramento. The couple was doing well financially, but that wasn't enough for Sandy.
She always wanted more and more and more. She was like a hungry animal, you know, that was in the woods and starving.
Then in December 1960, a house Ed had built caught fire, causing minor damage. Ed chalked it up to faulty wiring and collected the insurance money. But there was something suspicious about the blaze, and Ed soon began noticing changes in his wife's behavior. She had switched her name from Sandy back to Sante and was again arrested for shoplifting. Over the next several years, more and more of her husband's homes would catch fire, and the poor girl from Oklahoma would become a rich woman. By 1960, 26-year-old Sante Walker was on her second marriage and living in Sacramento, California. Her husband, Ed, was a successful contractor who provided her with a comfortable lifestyle. But Sante was frustrated. She craved excitement and luxury.
She would steal things that she didn't need and could afford. I think it showed an arrogance. I can get away with it.
Sante also began having affairs with Ed's wealthy business partners.
I see her use her sexuality as both a tool and a weapon. She's attracted a number of men through the course of her life, used this to advance her purposes.
Amid her infidelities, Sante gave birth to her first child, a son she named Kent, on September 27, 1962.
She was a great mom. And people have a hard time hearing me say that, but it's the truth. It's why I love her. I can tell you about birthday parties that were just over the top. I mean, clowns, the whole school's there having fun. Birthday presents, probably all stolen, but you felt pretty good.
While Sante enjoyed being a mother, it did nothing to curb her deviant behavior. Over the next 5 years, several of the homes Ed had built mysteriously caught fire. Sante made sure she personally collected the insurance money.
They're obvious arsons. I mean, with the iron plugged in, left on one side of the house and something spilled on the other side of the house. I mean, come on.
In 1967, Sante grew restless. Even with the extra money from the insurance claims, Ed could not provide the lifestyle she wanted. So she kicked him out and filed for divorce. This time she set out to marry a millionaire.
My mom would lecture me when I was 7, 8 years old about the importance of marrying rich. Don't fall in love with looks, don't fall in love with personality. The only thing that matters is money.
Sante took her son Kent and moved to Palm Springs. She got breast implants and wore large black wigs. To many, she resembled Elizabeth Taylor. Sante had read in Millionaire magazine about a divorced real estate developer named Kenneth Kimes, who was worth an estimated $20 million. She immediately set her sights on him. Kimes was 17 years older than Sante and had 2 children from a previous marriage. He guarded his money closely, but he was also an alcoholic, making him easy prey for Sante's manipulations. Sante threw herself at Kimes for a year. Finally, in 1971, she and son Kent moved into his Newport Beach home.
She found her millionaire. There was never a doubt in her mind what she wanted. Never. Once she decides to do something good or bad, it's going to get done. She never gave up.
The couple dined at fine restaurants and attended A-list parties, even when they were not invited.
Then one night, they got all dressed up and they had no place to go. And the first party they crashed was a place called the Blair House. And that night, the Blair House was hosting a party for Vice President Ford. Mom got them through the Secret Service, and they got the picture shot. Then they got kicked out of the Blair House.
By now, Sante had been with Kenneth Kimes for 4 years, and he still had not married her. According to his friends, he never would.
When he met my husband, and he goes, "Oh, you wait till you meet Sante, baby. She's the most gorgeous thing in the world, but I'm never going to marry her because if I do, you know, she's going to try to get all my money, and my money's going to go to my kids."
So Sante did the only thing she could think of to control him. She became pregnant with his child. On March 24, 1975, she gave birth to a son she named Kenneth Kareem Kimes. Kenny, as he was called, was her little prince. Later that year, the family moved to Hawaii, where they would live for the next several years in one beautiful home after another. Sante kept maids who catered to her every need.
We were invited to their house for dinner. We were met at the door by this uniformed maid. Then there was another uniformed maid who was taking care of the baby. I said, "Sante, it's so hard to get domestic help here. You know, tell me where you get them." She said, "Oh, darling, when I get to know you better, I'll tell you where to get one. They're my little slaves, and I love them."
Rather than hire legal immigrant housekeepers, Sante had been going to Mexico to find help. There, she'd convince young women to work for her in the States by promising they'd be paid well. Once they were in her home, they never received a dime and were not allowed to leave the house unless accompanied by her.
She took an iron and used it on one of the maids. She beat another one with hangers. She didn't pay them. They were her slaves.
In her mind, she truly believed that there were people who were of a different status. There are those that are born to be maids and born to be subservient, and those to be served.
While she abused the maids, she showered her young son Kenny with affection.
She totally adored her son. He would go sit in her lap and, they would hug each other. They were very touchy. She really acted like he could do no wrong.
Kenny was homeschooled by tutors and didn't often see other children. When he did, his outgoing personality caught their attention.
Children were immediately attracted to Kenny, very similarly the same way they were attracted to Sante. Kenny was very charming. He also had a charisma about him.
Kenny's tutor, Teresa Richards, also observed that her young student had a problem with lying. So to teach him a lesson, she told him Aesop's fable of the boy who cried wolf. The tutor soon learned that Sante had her own ideas about parenting.
The first thing he did, Mama, Papa, I have to tell you the story that Teresa told me. And there was no comment from Sante. She grabbed me by the arm and she pulled me downstairs, pushed me on the bed with two hands and said, "Don't you ever talk morals with my child again. There's a time to lie and a time not to lie, and I will be the one to teach him that."
In 1979, Sante and Kenneth returned to the mainland. They bought a home in an affluent neighborhood in Las Vegas. Sante brought along Kenny and her maids. But her older son, Kent, now 17, had had enough of life with his mother and stayed behind in Hawaii. By this time, authorities had been receiving complaints for years about Sante's treatment of her maids, but had done nothing about it. Then, in the summer of 1985, one of the maids escaped and went to the FBI for help. Sante and Kenneth were arrested several weeks later and charged with involuntary servitude. Kenneth agreed to a plea bargain, admitting that he'd known about Sante's abuse of the maids, but hadn't tried to stop it. The plea meant he would only receive probation. Sante, however, was advised to plead guilty and was sentenced to 5 years in prison.
The slavery case is extremely important to understanding Sante Kimes. It is the first time that she is convicted of a crime of a violent nature, and I think is key to understanding her capacity for using any means necessary, including threats and violence, to control.
Sante's prison sentence came as a shock to her 10-year-old son, Kenny. His mother was the center of his world, and now she was being taken away. With Sante gone, Kenny was about to experience life without his mother, but that wouldn't last for long. In 1986, 52-year-old Sante Kimes was sentenced to 5 years in a California prison for involuntary servitude. She'd been keeping Mexican maids in her home against their will since the early 1970s. With Sante in prison, life was about to change dramatically for her youngest son, Kenny. His father, Kenneth Kimes, didn't rehire his son's tutors, and for the first time, the 12-year-old went to school with other children. His father enrolled him at St. Vitus, an elite Catholic school in Las Vegas, where Kenny entered 7th grade.
Kenny was a very outgoing person, and right from the get-go. He was very easygoing, very easy to approach, always really wanted a lot of attention.
He was very social and he was very likable, loving to go to parties and football games. Acceptance for him in the group was important to him. Acceptance as one of the cool people to hang out with.
As a child, Kenny had been isolated and pampered by his mother. Now that she wasn't around, his father indulged him. Soon the Kimes house became the meeting place for the neighborhood boys.
I remember going over to his house a lot, and we would always play around and jump on the trampoline, go swimming in his pool.
Kenny's social life was thriving, and so was his home life. He still saw his mother, Sante, during monthly visits to prison, but he had grown much closer to his father, who by now was in his 70s.
Kenny was closer than the average kid to his father. Kenny looked up to his father very much. They had a perfect relationship for that period of time when Kenny's mother was in prison.
But to Kenny's older half-brother, Kent, who was now married with one child, the boy's father was just as bad an influence on Kenny as his mother had been. The millionaire had grown paranoid after spending years running from the law with Sante. He taught Kenny to trust no one, including his own mother.
When you're taught to hate your mom, when you're taught that everyone out there are vultures and they're out to get you and that they're enemies and that's the way you should treat them, what kind of moral value are you teaching your son?
But for Kenneth and Kenny, life without Sante would come to an abrupt end. In 1989, she was paroled after serving 3 years of a 5-year prison sentence.
The only thing that prison time did for my mother was make her more angry and make her more dangerous. Mother vowed never to go back to prison. Now, she didn't vow not to do anything wrong again. She vowed never to get caught again.
I remember the day that she was released. It was something Kenny had not been looking forward to. It was probably fair to say that he was dreading her coming back into his life. I remember him being upset to the point of tears.
Kenny was also distressed that his father, whom he had viewed as an ally, now stood back and let Sante call the shots. During Sante's absence, Kenny had grown into an independent teenager. Sante didn't like this new side of her son. So she made him transfer high schools and wouldn't allow him to see his friends, calling them a bad influence.
It was quite strange that when his mom did come back into his life, that she pretty much severed all ties with Kenny's friends. And I think he really resented that.
Soon the family began moving from house to house, just as they had done before Sante went to prison. Moving around was hard on 16-year-old Kenny. He began acting out violently, and according to his half-brother Kent, even plotted to kill his mother.
Kenny had a lot of anger towards Mom. One time he was going to take her rope and strangle her. I physically wrestled him to the ground.
After graduating from high school in 1993, Kenny enrolled at the University of California at Santa Barbara. The 18-year-old appeared to be a normal college student, spending his time in pursuit of girls and parties. But as he neared the end of his freshman year, his life was about to turn upside down. On March 28, 1994, Kenneth Kimes died of an aneurysm at the age of 74.
The death of his father was a huge blow to him, and his mother was the major figure in his life at that point. And those two factors together seemed to have kind of led him on a really terrible path.
He moved back in with his mom, lived with her on a daily basis, where she reasserted her influence and her dominance over him, and I think he just got to where anything Mom says I have to do, I'm going to do.
Kenny soon dropped out of college to focus on a business he'd started with the help of his mother, selling Cuban cigars over the internet.
He started telling me these stories about how he and his mom were making these trips to Cuba to buy these Cuban cigars. And he told me about these back alley deals and the slums of Havana, how exciting it is. And, you know, I could really see that, man, he was really into this. So I knew he was changing. I mean, this was not the Kenny I had come to know.
Kenneth Kimes' death also meant that life was going to change drastically for Sante. He had willed his fortune to his 2 children from a previous marriage and had left nothing to her or Kenny. On the surface, the widow appeared to be a loving mother and grandmother, as seen here in this home video shot about a month after Kenneth's death.
Give Grandma kisses. Kisses for Grandma. Love her.
But the 59-year-old ex-con was not going to accept being cut off from her husband's millions. She needed a plan and a partner.
They were inseparable. And it spooked me. And it spooked me enough where I was thinking, okay, Kenny, you're going to blow your life here.
60-year-old Sante Kimes was facing an uncertain future following the death of her millionaire husband Kenneth in 1994. He had willed his fortune to his children from a previous marriage, leaving Sante and their 19-year-old son Kenny with nothing. But the woman who had spent years as a millionaire's wife was not about to give up her lavish lifestyle.
That's my mother.
She was determined to get money any way she could, and she would recruit Kenny to help her.
This kid was emotionally dependent on his mother. She knew exactly what made him operate. She needed a surrogate to act out the way she did, and was able to press those buttons which were carefully, sort of sewn into his character and his personality so that she could access him when the time was right, and that's what she did.
In September 1996, the mother and her son went to the Bahamas to secretly withdraw money from Kenneth Kimes' offshore accounts. There they met with a bank auditor who was on to them.
He had dinner with them. That's when he was last seen. The restaurant folks remember Sante and Kenneth, and then they all left, and he's gone after that. Zippo. It's just no trace of the man.
By the time the authorities started looking for them, Sante and Kenny were long gone. It is believed that they left the island without collecting a dime. Now, Sante was desperate for money, and she would have to put another plan into play. On January 31st, 1998, a 2-alarm fire broke out at the Kimes house in Las Vegas. Investigators learned that the deed to the house had recently been transferred to an acquaintance of the Kimes named David Kasdan.
She had that house put into Kasdan's name, then took out a loan against the house in Mr. Kasdan's name. And then Mr. Kasdan gets a little payment book in the mail that tells him that he now owes $280,000 on a house that he didn't even know he owned.
Kasdan, who lived in California, called Sante to complain. Shortly after their conversation, his body was found in a dumpster near the Los Angeles airport on March 14, 1998. Police suspected that Sante and Kenny were somehow involved, but they didn't have enough evidence to arrest them.
There's no doubt in my mind that there is nothing my mother is capable of not doing. You did not want to be an enemy of the Kimeses, because that meant they could justify doing anything to you to protect themselves.
Nearly a month after Kasdan's murder, Sante and Kenny left Los Angeles. The two had heard about a widowed socialite named Irene Silverman, who owned a posh brownstone in New York City.
They had learned that this 82-year-old retired ballerina, married to a real estate entrepreneur, had this house, very elegant house on East 65th Street that she was renting out on a hotel basis.
The plan was to do away with Irene, take over the $7 million estate, and eventually sell it and pocket the money. Kenny moved into one of Silverman's apartments under the alias Manny Guerin. On July 2, 1998, Sante used false documents identifying her as Irene Silverman to get a deed transfer to Silverman's property notarized. 3 days later, Irene Silverman was reported missing.
It was very uncharacteristic of Irene to leave her residence. The more we learned about Irene, the more and more this case became suspicious.
Silverman's staff gave police a clue about a possible suspect, the tenant from apartment 1B, who called himself Manny Guerin. When Guerin disappeared, authorities began to suspect foul play. Later that night, Sante and Kenny were arrested in front of the New York City Hilton, though not for the disappearance of Irene Silverman.
They were arrested for a vehicle that they had purchased with a bad check in Cedar City, Utah.
But at the time of the arrest, Sante happened to be carrying a bag containing $10,000 and Silverman's ID. She insisted they hadn't done anything wrong. Kenny, however, panicked.
He wet his pants when he was grabbed by the authorities. That is a very unusual reaction. I think Kenny was so panicked that when they grabbed him out of the blue like that, he was so shaken, he just lost it for a few seconds.
It was actually one of the saddest moments in his life because at that particular moment, I think he realized that Mom wasn't in control anymore. That world that he'd had for the 23 years before that just got taken away from him.
What makes it hard for someone like Kenny Kimes to separate from his mother is that a grand seduction occurred beginning in childhood, which made it impossible for this kid to ever look at himself as a separate human being. So really it sounds kind of preposterous, but nonetheless she had a slave, and this guy could not emotionally extricate himself from his master.
When they arrested Sante and Kenny, authorities didn't know that across town, police were searching for an elderly woman who matched the ID in Sante's purse. Nearly 2 days later, a New York City detective working the Kimes case happened to see a TV news report on Silverman's disappearance and recognized the police sketch of Kenny.
He immediately called his office, and that's how it was put together that the Kimes had in their possession some papers with Irene's name on it, and that they may have some knowledge as to where Irene is.
Police quickly figured out that the doting mother and loving son they had in custody were two of the most wanted criminals in the country. The Kimes arrest and the story of their sensational crime spree would become the center of a tabloid frenzy, and the mother and son would soon find themselves in court.
Please, please be fair. This case needs your attention and your scrutiny.
On July 5th, 1998, Sante and Kenny Kimes were arrested in New York City for stealing a car. Within 48 hours, the 63-year-old mother and her 23-year-old son were also linked to the disappearance of a wealthy socialite named Irene Silverman. The media was fascinated with their bizarre story, and while awaiting trial, Sante made sure she stayed in the spotlight.
It is my great pleasure to introduce my beloved attorneys who are champions of justice and who I know will prove our innocence because we are innocent.
I would say that anybody who would have the chance to meet either one of them would truly be enthralled with them. And you would never detect or sense that either one of them would be involved in criminal activity.
But Sante's efforts to sway public opinion backfired. Just before their trial, Sante and Kenny appeared together on 60 Minutes. During the interview, the mother and son held hands and caressed each other. Their behavior sparked rumors that they had an incestuous relationship. Those rumors continued as they went on trial in February 2000 for Irene Silverman's murder.
Sante and Kenneth Kimes have this bond. It's a very close bond. When they were in court at various hearings, they would hold hands, whisper in each other's ear, and until a judge told them to stop holding hands in an outburst.
I thought the closeness was strange, but I never thought once he became close to even thinking about anything incestuous.
The murder case against Sante and Kenny Kimes was unusual in that no body was ever found. But authorities did discover 17 notebooks that the prosecution argued contained a detailed list of items needed to carry out Irene Silverman's murder, then transfer the deed of her $7 million home to Sante.
The notebooks were very telling, very revealing about how they were plotting. They practiced certain things. They planned ahead. They wrote notes. They went over things. They practiced her signature.
The notebooks certainly were written by both Sante and Kenneth Kimes. However, there isn't anything in the notebooks which would show that they were planning a murder.
During the trial, Sante and her defense team did everything they could to convince the jury she was a wealthy grandmother who was being framed.
the way she dressed, letting her hair gray. We had this image of Sante Kimes being this gray-haired, almost grandmother-type looking woman, and then we had no idea until the prosecution showed us a couple of pictures of what she would have looked like outside the courtroom.
I really believe she did it. But what scared me was that she's always gotten off, always. No matter how bad the deal was, she's always gotten off, and I thought sure she was going to get out of this one.
But this time, she wasn't so lucky. In May 2000, Sante and Kenny were found guilty of second-degree murder. They were each sentenced to more than 120 years in prison. As the verdict was read, a stunned Sante stared at the jurors from across the courtroom. Her son had a very different reaction.
I've never been so upset as by Kenny's reaction. He laughed and he talked the whole time that the verdict was being read.
2 months later, mother and son appeared on Larry King Live, claiming they were framed.
You don't realize that these police are running wild in this city and that they are getting away with murdering the Constitution, and that this case is a precedent case because if they get away with this, every American in this world is in trouble.
I did not do this. I did not commit this crime. I was arrested at the Hilton. There were no eyewitnesses. There was no physical evidence. I have no motive to commit this.
Sante and Kenny made headlines again in October 2000, when during an interview with Court TV, Kenny held a producer hostage, threatening to stab her in the throat with a pen. After 4 hours, he released the woman unharmed.
He was desperate. The situation had changed. He lost. He's facing the rest of his life in jail.
Then in June 2001, Sante and Kenny were extradited to California to stand trial for the 1998 murder of Los Angeles businessman David Kasdan. As Sante and Kenny Kimes wind their way through the courts, perhaps more will be revealed about what motivated this domineering mother and her hardened son to prey on the vulnerable and kill in cold blood.
She's a natural-born con artist, is what she is. She thought she had this ability to talk her way out of everything.
She will always consider herself to be the victim of this conspiracy that destroyed her life. She will never be able to accept the responsibility of her own actions.
When you don't have a sense of right or wrong and a sense of value for human life, then I think that that evil just creeps in and gets bigger and bigger.
She had control over this child, and she cloned him into her. He didn't have a chance. He did not have a chance.
Here's Kenny at the helm.